What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving back into user-submitted tattoos, more specifically, apprentices. So we're going to find out if they're on the right track or they need to find something else to do with their lives. You ready? Let's get it. Alright, the first submission is sent in by M out of Tennessee, and they have been on skin for about 4.5 months. M, you sent over this Gengar tattoo that I think needs quite a bit of help. When you look at the lines, the line weights are just all over the place. You've got some areas that are very thin and others that are just very thick and doubled up. When we look at this pumpkin line that runs into Gengar's foot, it seems like you doubled up that line and it just looks messy. There's really just no consistency throughout this entire tattoo when it comes to your lines. And I know you're pretty new, but we gotta fix these because the outlines are the framework to how everything else turns out. If you don't have good outlines, the rest of the tattoo is just gonna be set up for failure. Even the leaves have this really thick black outline around them, and I think that thick outline should have been left for Gengar himself. And I know I've said before in the past that the things in front should have a thicker outline, but when it comes to this tattoo, those leaves aren't as important as Gengar. The idea is to draw your eyes to the main subject matter and not so much the less important parts, and then vary your line weights accordingly. Had you swapped those line weights, it would have immediately drawn our eyes to Gengar, and it would have had a nice contrast up against that purple. And speaking of that purple, it just came out really flat. There's not really a whole lot of shape or depth. I noticed you did try to add some darker shades, but you really need to add some actual black. Don't be scared. Also, those shades are not where they belong. You've got some shadows on the left arm, and then you've got a shadow on the right side of Gengar, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I know this is an animated character, but we really have to pay attention to where our light source is coming from. It's just going to make it more dynamic in general. I know we already talked about the outlines, but when you look at the right eye, I can't really tell if that's a shade or an outline that you didn't commit to. But either way, you really got to be careful there because it just doesn't come off as clean. Getting back to the purple, I would have loved to seen some nice violet or dark purple in there against those black shades. And again, it would have given it some really nice depth up next to that light lavender. Because you had the right idea when it comes to the pumpkin. I see the browns, the oranges, the light oranges, and the yellow. That has some nice depth even though it might not be that well saturated. Had you used that same technique when it comes to Gengar, I think you would have been a lot happier with this tattoo. I'm not the biggest fan of that poop brown that you have in the eyes and the mouth of the pumpkin. Aside from it looking like it's not lit, it just comes off as really patchy. So again, I think you need to focus on your line weights, know what your main subject is to draw our eyes to that. Don't be so afraid of black shading and color in a more methodical manner. Don't just throw it in there. I think the easiest way to saturate is to color in layers and know where those light sources are so you can get the shape that you want to achieve. And be sure to practice on paper. Get some colored pencil or some markers and it'll become second nature when you apply it to skin. But thank you so much, M, for sending that in. Alright, the next submission sent in is from Kyler, and Kyler, you've been an apprentice for just over a year, and you sent in this pink flower. I forgot what type of flower this is. I think it's a lily. I don't know. You guys will let me know, I'm sure. I don't think the saturation is awful. I do think the white is a bit patchy, but I do think that it's missing a lot of black shading. Again, you can't be scared of that black shading because you can always color on top of that and it won't appear as black. It's likely when you were looking at the reference that you saw black only in the middle of the flower, but you also have to apply that black to the petals as well. You have to almost tattooify these things. Adding those black shades into these things is just going to give it a lot more longevity and also make those colors pop a lot more. And when it comes to the outlines, I do see some areas that kind of end abruptly. Maybe you tried to make them look a bit more soft, but it's really not reading as such. Finish off those outlines. When it comes to the writing, I know there's not a lot there to judge, but it does look a little messy. Maybe try using a thicker outline. But you did send over another tattoo of this lady face. And the first thing I notice are her eyebrows look a little weird. I know that's probably the start of the bridge of her nose, but it's just reading as an extra long eyebrow. The drips that are coming out of her eyes don't really come off as tears. They come off as, well, you know.
Oh, there's the money shot, baby.
I also see another area that I think was probably a mistake, and that's her second chin that interacts with her neck. I feel like that chin should have gone over the neck. Quite honestly, I think you could have done without that extra chin and mouth, and I think it would have looked a lot better. The double eyes themselves probably would have been enough. Now, I'm not sure what you were referencing or if you made this design yourself, but I'm just not a fan. When it comes to the hair, I can't really pinpoint it, but something just seems off to me. It almost looks like a helmet or bent aluminum. It seems really thin with that little drop shadow that's coming underneath that curl. When we pull up a reference of a similar design and look at the hair, you can tell that the lines are a lot more uniform and the black is there to give it some nice shape. It actually reads as hair. So to reiterate, Kyler, when looking at both of these tattoos, you really just gotta know how and where to use that black shading and how to control it. And once again, it just makes me wonder if you're drawing these designs and making sure everything looks good before applying it to skin. I don't think the flower is awful by any means, but you really gotta tighten these things up. But thank you so much for sending those in. The next tattoos are sent in from Vishal, and Vishal, you've mentioned you've been tattooing for about 2 years outside of a shop environment, but you weren't happy with the quality of your work. So you decided to get a proper apprenticeship where you've been actively tattooing for about 2 months now. The first one you sent in is this little broken heart chain, and right off the bat, I think this thing's pretty clean. You've got some really consistent parallel lines, and those white highlights are right where they need to be. I even like the little pieces that are coming off of the heart chain. I think it adds a nice little element to it. You can really tell you took your time with this one, and when I look at each side of each link, there's some really consistent black shades there. And when you combine that with those white highlights, it just makes this thing look nice and shiny and reflective. So great job on that one. Let's check out this demon mask you sent in. I'm not nearly as excited about this one as I was with the chain. When it comes to the saturation, there are some areas that are a bit patchy, like in the cheeks, the blue string, and that lightning in the background. And I don't think you utilized your white highlights very well in this one. You either have to choose to go with skin tone or go with white. When they're both together, it just clashes and it doesn't look that clean. But if you are going to put white in those places, you really should put them everywhere, because I notice all those whites on the top of the mask, but not so much on the bottom. But honestly, I think this thing would have looked a lot better had you not had those whites in there at all. I will say you have some good line weights going on though. You've got some nice thin outlines on the inside of the mask with some thicker outlines around the perimeter. And even the outlines that are going around the rope are pretty clean. I'm not sure what's going on with the dripping stuff coming off of the horns. It almost seems like it's a chrome, but it just seems out of place. But when we look at this panther head you sent in, I think this thing looks a lot nicer. The outlines are really clean and the shading seems intentional. I still think there is a bit of patchiness when it comes to the red, but this thing is a lot tighter. I mean, the handle of that dagger does look a little sus, but we'll let it slide. What is that, a Prince Albert? But again, I do want to commend you on taking the right steps and getting into a shop and recognizing that you did need some help. We see it over and over and over again. People think that they can do this themselves. They think it's a lot easier than it actually is, but nothing really beats being in a shop around professional tattooers, speaking from experience. But once again, thank you so much, Vishal, for sending those in, and keep up the great work. Hey apprentices, you've got a lot on your plate already, so why not take some of those more difficult choices out of the equation? Check out Mad Rabbit, some of the best tattoo aftercare on the market today, and worry less about how your tattoos are going to heal. Head on over to madrabbit.com and make sure to use code PONY20 to save 20% off of your entire order. All right, let's get back to it. All right, up next we've got James out of the Philippines. And James, you sent over this fallen angel looking character with a wreath behind it. And boy, oh boy, those muscles are a bit much. Now I know I've seen this image a ton of times, but he really must have been working out since the last time I saw it, because he is stacked. Damn thighs though, boy. It almost looks like a character out of Resident Evil. I do think the concept of this tattoo could be a really good idea. I just think a lot of things were executed rather poorly. So let's start at the top. When it comes to the little sun design with the cross above it, you really gotta dial that in, because you can see those small mistakes very easily. Like the two dots that are on either side just really aren't symmetrical. The one on the right is falling a bit lower and the one on the left is a bit higher. And those sun rays seem to have gotten away from you. There are some tighter ones, some a bit more loose. Again, just not as symmetrical as they should be. If we look at the wreath, there seems to be some odd spacing throughout, and it just seems really loose. We've already talked about the meatballs, or muscles, so we'll come down to this bottom design. I know these moon faces are supposed to be mirror images of each other, but if we look at those crescent shapes, again, it's just not symmetrical. Are we seeing a pattern here? I think before doing a tattoo that has human anatomy, you really should study it first. As humans, we know what human anatomy is supposed to look like. It's almost embedded in us. And I think this just missed the mark. I mean, you've got really good contrast here, but those muscles are wild. It almost seems like he got dunked into a vat of toxic sludge, or you were reading The Toxic Avenger before tattooing this. Yeah, I just don't know. That's just not what it's supposed to look like. So do yourself a favor and grab some anatomy books and study the heck out of it if this is the kind of stuff that you want to get into. But I do appreciate you, James, so much for sending that in. All right, up next we've got Dylan, who sent in a portrait of Lily Munster. You mentioned you've been on skin for just over a year now, and by the looks of it, I'd say you're on the right track. The eyes are striking and you do have some decent shading in the face, but there are a couple areas that I'd like to point out, like each side of her nostril. One side does look a bit bigger than the other. And since the client wasn't shaved all the way, it does look like she's rocking a nose ring. You really gotta remember to shave these things completely, because those little hairs do stand out like a sore thumb when you go to take the photo. When it comes to the eyebrows, one does look rather realistic while the other one looks fairly blocky. I don't know why you chose to outline that one. It seems like you can see the individual hairs on the one on the left, and that's how it should be. Although I do like the shading on the hands, I think those outlines around the knuckles really do age her a bit. She almost looks like somebody's grandma. But maybe those will soften out when it heals and it'll look better. And although the hair does look better than the other hair we saw earlier in this episode, it still does look a bit sketched in. I want to like it, but it's just not quite there. I think the hair on the right side does look quite a bit better. It just blends in a bit more. So overall, I think you did do pretty decent with this one. And you did send over another tattoo of Tolly from South Park. Let's check that out. Now this one isn't bad by any means, and I personally struggle when it comes to light blues, and obviously I can tell you did too. Blues can be rather tough to saturate, and it does look like you struggled a bit when it comes to that left side. Maybe try turning your machine down and moving your hand a bit slower, and that might help you out a bit. Or just don't do tattoos that have blue. It does seem like the outlines on the bottom half of this tattoo are fairly solid, but it seems like they got a little wiggly near the top, a little piggly wiggly. And I do wonder what the reference of this looks like, because when it comes to the pupils of the eyes, I do know he's a bit up, but one of those pupils touches the bottom of the eyelid and the other doesn't. The blue area above the eyes and around the eyebrows does look a bit patchy. It seems like you really didn't take your time there, because the bottom of the towel does look nice and saturated, but it seems like you have a hard time when it comes to those tight spaces. Just go slow and take your time, and everything will be coming up Millhouse.
Everything's coming up Millhouse.
Oh, sorry, wrong cartoon. So for being a year in, you're really not doing too bad. You just gotta focus on slowing down and work on those smaller details. So thank you so much, Dylan, for sending that in. Up next, I wanted to give you guys an update on Nichole Smith, who sent in an apprentice tattoo in February of last year. If you wanted to hear what I had to say about that, check out this video here. But to recap, I mentioned that her line work was pretty strong, but it fell short when it came to her stipple shading. There wasn't really any variation in tone, so her tattoo just ended up looking a bit flat. But you can tell with the one that she had sent in today that she has grown quite a bit. I think you really excelled when it comes to that stipple shading, Nikki, as I love the layering that this tattoo has. All those folds in her hair are completely legible, and even when it comes to that negative space, it's just on point. There is a lot more depth in this tattoo than there is with the first one you sent in. So I'm very excited, Nikki, to see how far you've progressed, and thank you so much for the update. And if any of you viewers have been featured on this series, please feel free to send us an update. I love to see them. All right, well, that's gonna wrap it up for the critiques this week, but before we get to my featured artist, you know we gotta talk about my favorite tattoo of the episode, which was sent in from Vishal with this little heart chain. Although this one is simple, that just goes to show you that you don't need a complex design to make a solid tattoo. That being said, I just love how clean this thing came out. All those little parallel lines are nice and sharp, and those white highlights are right where they need to be to make this thing look metallic. And that's what a good tattoo is all about, just really taking the time in every little area and producing a tattoo that you can be proud of. We might not always be given the best designs, but you can really tell when somebody puts love into their work. So thank you, Vishal, for putting that love into your work, and congratulations once again on being my favorite this week. And finally, I want to put a spotlight on somebody who is fresh off the apprenticeship boat, somebody who I think you should all be following, and that is Fonte out of Borrowed Time in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You can tell that he puts that love that I was talking about into each and every one of his tattoos, and it doesn't matter what the design is, because he's doing tattoos from traditional all the way to realism and killing everything in between. Someone doing this well right out of their apprenticeship, you can tell is going to be around for a long time, and I'm super proud of him. Not only that, but his ballpoint pen drawings are amazing. So do yourself a favor and go learn more about this kid. Go check out his podcast called Unemployable Podcast with John Nelson and follow him on all socials. You won't be disappointed, and make sure to let him know I sent you. All right, that's going to be it, folks. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and if you'd like to see your work critiqued on this series, you can do so by sending them to ponycritiques@gmail.com. All right, that's it. We're out of here. See you guys next week.